Welcome back to Aether Hour, everybody. I'm your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalugin here with a much anticipated sequel episode. We are here with part 2 of our discussion with Gregory Heers on St. John Vatatzes. This is going to be an episode focusing on the prophecies about his return as the Marble Emperor and the history of those prophecies going all the way back to ancient times up through the modern saints today, how they factor in, of course, to World War III, which is what we discuss over on World War Now. So this is the true bridge episode between Aether Hour and World War Now. The worldview is all coming together. For those of you that have been following us from the beginning, this has been something we have always planned to do even before we started World War Now, let alone Aether Hour. So this has been much anticipated. We're going to be taking you through a timeline of a lot of these prophecies. I'll give you a bit more of a background. Gregory has a lot to talk about. Dmitry has a lot to discuss. Dmitry, I'm glad to have you with us. How are you doing?
Yeah, doing great. Very excited to have this detailed and frankly unprecedented discussion, which I've not found on the internet before. And, we're going to tie in a lot of these different stories and lives of saints from various, even church jurisdictions. And it's good to have you, Gregory, Heers on with us today to sort of bring in that very much needed information, especially from the Greek Orthodox world, which a lot of people simply don't have access to. And furthermore, those who do have access to the information do not have the willpower to do all the research and thoroughly examine a lot of this material and essentially provide it to our listeners. And we're very fortunate to have you here. So thank you again for joining us.
And between the last time you heard me and Gregory on a podcast together, we both embarked on a wonderful pilgrimage together to Mount Athos. So we are now much more spiritually aligned, more spiritually prepared to discuss this issue, which of course is very relevant to the Athonite mind, which you hear a lot of talk about at the monasteries of Elder Ephraim. And we're going to talk about what Elder Ephraim said about this on this topic. And Gregory also is, unlike last time, he's now on Twitter, so you can follow him at Here's Gregory on X, which is great to see. He's already made some great posts. But right before we dive in and I hand it over to Gregory, be sure to like, restack, retweet, share this video, whatever platform you're listening on, because we really want to get this information out. We think this is going to be one of our best and most important episodes. So thank you all for the shares and everything. Please do that if you can down below. And with all of that, Gregory, we want to talk about St. John Vatatzes. Thank you for being with us. How are you doing?
Hello, Conrad. Hello, Dmitry. It's great to be back. It was great being on the pilgrimage with you, Conrad, getting to know you better. And I'm really excited for this episode. This is the first time that even though I was familiar with most of these prophecies, first time I sat down and collected them and studied them right next to each other in comparison. So yeah, let's go.
Yeah, so I think it's prompt to kind of commence this discussion as where we left off. So essentially, we didn't discuss the passing and the death of St. John III Vatatzes, St. John the Merciful, in our previous episode. But in order to cover this, we just need to cover a few details regarding the last days of his life or the last few years. So essentially, diplomatically speaking and politically, we know St. John III captured a large majority or liberated the large majority of mainland Greece away from the Latins, the Crusaders. Of course, the Crusaders still kept Constantinople and the walls of Constantinople were still upstanding. And St. John III, the only thing, at least this is what historians believe, the only thing stopping him, of course, from besieging Constantinople and taking it assuredly in his final years, despite the fact that he was, a skilled general and a skilled political leader, was the fact that there were fears that the Pope, who was extremely agitated, this is, if you can imagine, the middle of the 13th century is the peak of papal supremacy, only because St. John's father-in-law, actually, so St. John married, after the death of his first wife, Irene, married a young lady from the house of Hohenstaufen. So this was the daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor, Friedrich II. Now, Friedrich II is a fascinating figure. We covered him briefly in the previous episode, but he almost needs his own episode, I think, if we ever focused on German kings. He is perhaps the most interesting Holy Roman Emperor, if you can even think of it in that capacity. He successfully led the Sixth Crusade, recaptured Jerusalem for a brief period of time without actually fighting because he could speak Arabic. So he won Jerusalem in the late 1220s and allowed Orthodox and Catholic pilgrims to travel there simply via diplomacy because he could speak Catholic and he spoke to the Sultan of Palestine at the time and basically coordinated handing over the city to the Holy Roman Emperor, which was very fascinating. And his daughter, Anna, was married to St. John of Vatatzes. It appears that perhaps the marriage was a chaste one in a similar fashion to perhaps St. Marcian, the emperor who held the Council of Chalcedon, and his wife Pulcheria, because as you can imagine, that marriage in the past, there were certain marriages in the Orthodox Christian lives of saints which had essentially no intimate relations. There's a rare few. St. Marcian, St. Pulcheria is one, St. John of Kronstadt actually, and his wife as well. But it is my sort of theory that perhaps this is why St. John III and his second wife, Anna of Hohenstaufen, had no children. And they probably lived in a similar, St. John III was already very ascetic, but they lived perhaps as more like monastics. Anna was born Constance, and when she became baptized into the Orthodox Church, they gave her the name Anna. And so towards the end of his life, St. John III primarily spent most of his time in Nicaea. And of course, every year, just after Easter and during the winter period, he would travel to Nymphaeon, his favorite city, further down south next to Ephesus. Now, what's interesting is, of course, unfortunately, is Friedrich II, his father-in-law, the Holy Roman Emperor, he fought a series of civil wars and essentially wars against the Pope, who we know St. John III also had huge issues with multiple popes, and the popes excommunicated St. John's father-in-law, Friedrich II. And in 1250, unfortunately, Friedrich II, just before Christmas, became sick and he passed away. And after this, papal supremacy reigned supreme. The symphonia that Friedrich II attempted to build between the Western Emperor and the Pope was completely broken. The papacy became this dominant structure which dominated, Western Europe all the way up until the Protestant Reformation. And unfortunately, that hope of perhaps maybe reestablishing a Western Roman Empire, through a dynastical marriage, as well as maybe even a reestablishment of Orthodoxy, the defeat of the Filioque, this project unfortunately fell under. And St. John III, spending most of his time in the eastern part of his empire, eventually, throughout his lengthy life, towards in his early 60s, fell ill. This took place in February of 1254. So in February of 1254, St. John fell ill in the city of Nicaea. It seems that he was suffering from some sort of temporary paralysis. At times he would fall asleep or simply couldn't speak, couldn't ride his horse properly for hours on end. At times he would not wake up and he would simply lose conscience. It wasn't clear exactly what was taking place with him, but his doctors couldn't assist him. And so in February, his illness got so bad that he wanted to go to Nymphaeon to meet his end. He was hoping to die somewhere around Easter time after Great Lent. And so he traveled to Nymphaeon and remained in Nymphaeon even past Easter, all the way up until November of 1254, wherein he passed away in his favorite city surrounded by clergy. As you can imagine, St. John III's passing was such a big shock to the entire empire, who've lived under his patronage for 33 years. He reigned as the Eastern Roman Emperor and the Emperor of Nicaea. It was a huge loss to the people, and I think to the entire Orthodox world, even the Russians up north who were suffering under the Mongol yoke. Simply having this powerful Roman Greek autocrat in the south who could at least command some sort of respect and protect them at least diplomatically from their enemies was already a huge boost to their morale, considering they were under the Mongol yoke. And of course, St. John III, his passing was a huge shock, of course, to his native people. After his passing, as Gregory, I think, will underline, St. John III was buried. His funeral was very lavish. Lots of people from the West as well as the East came to visit. He had, of course, very strong diplomatic relations with both the Bulgarians and even his neighboring Turks who conquered most of Anatolia. He was always very kind to their refugees and very kind to people who needed to come to the empire for short visits. As we know, his trading with neighboring peoples was always very generous. And he was always known for being very diplomatic and kind, which is why they call him the merciful. After his passing, 7 years had passed and his tomb was uncovered due to local veneration. It was customary to, shall we say, redress his relics and wash them. And once the tomb was uncovered in Nymphaeon and it was opened up, the body of St. John III appeared that it had not been corrupted at all. So essentially it had not deteriorated. It was almost as if he was asleep. And this level of incorruptibility in relics is very unusual. Not all relics in the Orthodox Christian world reach a level of such incorruptibility. In fact, this shocked people so much that instantly they redressed the body of St. John. they took the sarcophagus in a huge church procession about 30 to 40 kilometers north to the city of Magnesia, which was the central city. Magnesia had its own bishop. And from there on in, from around the 1260s onwards, St. John III and his relics were in fact resting in Magnesia, not Nymphaeon thereafter. And this is linked to, of course, the miraculous appearances of St. John III as the guardian of Magnesia, and you can say all of Western Anatolia, Western Turkey. From there on in, he would appear miraculously on the walls of the city of Magnesia during the siege of the city by the Turks in the 1300s, and thereon after. There was always very broad veneration of him, having essentially become the patron saint of the city in a similar fashion to Saint Demetrius, the miracle worker and the great martyr of Thessaloniki, wherein he appeared multiple times during the various military confrontations around Thessaloniki to save his Orthodox people who resided in the city. So it's a very powerful patron saint that Magnesia received in those years.
Saint Nicodemus the Hagurite, in his Synaxarion that he wrote and published, mentions that when they exhumed the relics of St. John, not only was his body incorrupt, but it didn't have any trace of blackness on his skin or any bad odor. He looked as if he was still alive, he says. His members were still movable, soft, and his cheeks even had that reddish tint a living person's cheeks would have. So not only that, but many miracles started happening. Sicknesses were cured, demons were cast out, all by the grace of God that dwelt in him. And at this point, it would be, I'd like to mention that apparently St. Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain loved this saint very much, because not only did he translate the extensive life from Older Greek into more modern Greek, but he also composed a complete service for St. John. And his relics were in Magnesia of Asia Minor all this time, up until 102 years ago. And the miracle that Dimitri mentioned, the historian Pachymeres, he mentions that when the nightly guard who was charged with keeping watch against any Turkish attacks, he noticed that many times at night, the light of a candle would wander around the walls. The commander sent many men to try to figure out what's happening. They couldn't find out what it was. And finally, they sent the deaf and dumb brother of the commander, who had been deaf and dumb since birth. And when he came back, miraculously, he could speak and hear, and he told them that he saw, where the light was, he saw a majestic man with a royal stature who was loudly urging the men to continue defending the city against the Turks. He recognized that this figure was St. John Vatatzes the Merciful, and ever since then, the entire city unanimously recognized his holiness. Now, his relics were in Magnesia in the church dedicated to, I think it was St. Athanasius there, up until 1922. Now, that's when the Asia Minor catastrophe happened. That's when the Greeks lost the war in Asia Minor. The army retreated, and not only the army, but all the Orthodox of Asia Minor, even the ones who didn't speak Greek, who only spoke Turkish, were expelled, oftentimes genocidally. Many were killed, many men were exterminated in these Turkish work camps. Talking about a real Holocaust here. And the ones that survived and they came to Greece, it did not bring the relics with them. To me, this strikes me as extremely odd, because we know that the Christians who were in Cappadocia, which is much farther away from Greece than Magnesia just across the water. You know, as soon as you cross over into Asia, that you're there basically. Cappadocia is 4 times farther away. And yet, 2 towns in Cappadocia, the one they brought the relics of St. John the Russian, the other they brought not only the relics of St. Gregory the Theologian, but they even took apart the entire iconostasis of their church and brought it to Greece and reassembled it there. These are the people who would leave behind their own belongings in order to bring the relics of the saints. So for the inhabitants of Magnesia not to bring the relics of St. John, who was so incorrupt and so miraculous, not to bring them with them, I can only see this happening if they had received a direct, explicit revelation from God or from one of the saints of God telling them to leave the relics here. And we know that the legend or the tradition says that they were moved in the vicinity of Constantinople, somewhere underground of Constantinople. And according to this tradition, he is still in this incorruptible state. his hand is on his sword, on the handle of his sword. The sword is in its sheath. And slowly, the sword is being extracted. He is pulling the sword out of its sheath. And when the entire sword is out, that's when he will rise again to do what he is to do, which we'll talk about later.
Yeah, I think we're going to talk about exactly how far the sword is out of its sheath. It's getting very interesting. St. Joseph the Hesychast, Elder Ephraim, they talked a lot about that specifically. But before we get into some of the earliest prophecies, some of the prophecies that mention many of these themes and the emperor and, some of these future disputes between nations come from ancient times. Some of them, of course, are modern. We're going to take you through them a bit chronologically. But Gregory, I think you had a story about an iconographer and the current location of St. John Vatatzes, if you wanted to tell that story before you dive into St. Methodius or some of the other ancient prophecies that we're going to talk about here.
Yes, of course. Yes. This was 2 years ago. I think it was about 3 years ago. Not much more than that. I was with my father in Mount Athos, the feast of one of the monasteries there. And the fathers were speaking, and a certain spiritual father, who was this spiritual child of Elder Ephraim, he told us the following story, that one of his spiritual children is an iconographer. He was in Constantinople. He was called there to repair and do some work at the Patriarchate. And when he was almost finished, 2 days before he was ready to return to Greece, he was approached by one of the Orthodox there, and he was told that there's a man who wants your services. He wants you to do some iconography. The people there at the Patriarchate, they told him, go with him. He's very trustworthy. So the iconographer, at that point, that day and time, he gets into the car, and the man there, I believe he was a Turkish man, a local. He was Orthodox, but he was a local there in the city. Forgive me, I don't know if he was ethnically Turkish, or there are still some Romans there. So he gets in the car, and the man says, forgive me, but I have to blindfold you. I cannot see where we're going. It's a matter of utmost safety and security. So the iconographer, obeying what they had told him to trust the man, he agrees. So they drive for about an hour. Now, the Patriarchate is right in the center of the old city. An hour from that would be really anywhere. The metropolitan area of Constantinople is huge. Think of New York City. Eventually, they get out. They take him out somewhere in this building. They go down some stairs. They go underground. And finally, they take off the blindfold, and he is in this underground chamber. And at the other end of this chamber is a man seated on a chair, on some sort of throne or seat. He looks like he's sleeping, and he's dressed with these old-fashioned imperial costume and sword and all. And they asked him to do some iconography on the walls of that chamber. He did that. And then when he came back, he went to his spiritual father, and he said, I have to tell you this because the marble emperor, as they call him in Greece, is real, and I saw him with my own eyes. And this was no more than 5 or 6 years ago maximum.
That's an incredible story, and I have a somewhat similar story that I believe I've told on some episode of Aether Hour, or maybe even World War Now sometime in the past. I don't believe it was on part 1. Maybe it was, but forgive me, but I will be telling that behind the paywall near the end of the episode when we are talking about more modern phenomenon and our interpretation of perhaps how some of these things could go down, and discussing, of course, the prophecies we are about to get into. But again, we have many prophecies dating all the way back to even the 4th century that discuss this. And of course, there are dual natures to some of these prophecies, both going up even through to St. Cosmas as well, where there were some imminent events that were being prophesied, but these prophecies in many ways can also apply to more transcendent events. Dimitri, I don't know if you have anything to say about Gregory's story, but we probably want to talk about the prophecies of St. Methodius and St. Tarasius as well. And Gregory, I know that you have, before we were recording this, we were doing a bit of research on all the sources and everything, and you have some great sources on St. Andrew the Fool for Christ and his prophecies as well. You've been telling me ever since episode 1 a lot of the research that you had been doing and the translations you had been doing of a lot of these interesting works, which again, if you look any of this stuff up in the English language, you're not going to find any of this information about St. John, let alone tying all of these prophecies in with it and making the obvious connection that, of course, we have from the modern saints, Elder Ephraim being one of the most prominent. So, Dimitri, I don't know if you have anything to say, but then we'll get to Gregory on these prophecies.
Yeah, I think when our listeners may be taken aback. They're like, oh, wait a minute. So you're telling me that St. John III, not only did he pass away, but he's in a state of dormition, similar to the feast day of the dormition of the Theotokos. So when we speak about saints passing away, it's almost, we say that they have fallen asleep in the Lord, right? These two things are almost linked. And despite the fact that St. John III literally had a funerary service, right? But in fact, the Lord may in fact bring him back. That particular clairvoyant prophecy, which the saints have passed on to us, and all these various legends from across time, especially essentially speak to, I think definitely has some grounds to it. And I think let's make a quick analogy to the 7 sleeping youths of Ephesus. I think this is probably the best analogy. And the reason I give it is because there are other references by, say, Saint Seraphim of Sarov, who makes these references to the sleeping youths very often in his life. The 7 holy youths, or the 7 sleepers of Ephesus, if you recall, were from the city of Ephesus, naturally, right next to Magnesia and Nymphaeon, literally a few hours away at that. And in fact, their relics, we know, were still kept in that same cave in which they woke up. And a Russian pilgrim, actually, Hegumen Daniel, during his famous pilgrimage to the Holy Land, on the way to the Holy Land, he actually stopped at Ephesus. And this was in the 1100s, right after the First Crusade, so before even St. John's time, and he recalls seeing the holy relics of the youths in that cave. So we can only imagine that even St. John III Vatatzes, during his reign, those relics were still there in the cave, ready to be venerated, and in fact, he most likely venerated them every time their feast day came around. He would visit Ephesus and venerate the relics of the local saints. So in fact, these two stories are linked in that particular capacity by simple geography, but more so the actual life of the saint. So when we look at the 7 youths of Ephesus, their story essentially circulates around them facing martyrdom and essentially inevitable death as they are enclosed and essentially entombed alive in a cave by the Roman Emperor Decius in the 250s AD. So this is 75 years before the Council of Nicaea. The persecution of Christians was still ongoing in the Roman Empire, unfortunately. And the 7 youths, these Orthodox Christians who did not wish to denounce Christ, were essentially locked up alive in this cave, right? It was completely sealed up. And the Lord, granting mercy on them, and in order to further provide providential grace to, future Orthodox Christians, had the 7 youths fall asleep into a certain, you can say, grace-filled hibernation of sorts. And they slept there in this cave for over 200 years. And they awoke during the time of just before the Fourth Ecumenical Council, actually, between the Third and the Fourth Ecumenical Council, the Third Ecumenical Council, which took place in Ephesus, actually, in their city. They awoke and their bodies were actually discovered. The cave was uncovered by grave robbers and treasure hunters who actually found certain jewels, and then they found 7 sleeping youths. They woke them up. As you can imagine, to the surprise of the youths, they woke up literally 200 years later into the future. And naturally awoken, they began speaking about Orthodox Christianity to the people around. The moral of this particular story and why the Lord needed their awakening at this time in the 430s AD, during the reign of Theodosius II and the Third Ecumenical Councils, because the local people in Western Asia Minor and Anatolia had begun faltering in their faith, not believing in the final resurrection at the end of days. And so when you do read the story of the 7 youths of Ephesus, that is made an emphasis on, is that these 7 youths, they woke up in August of that year and they preached for several months. In fact, they even spoke to the local clergyman. This was a huge miracle. In fact, the Roman emperor at the time, Theodosius II, who was also a saint in our church, one of the few Roman emperors who are saints, came and visited them. And this was a major event in the entire Roman Empire that these Orthodox youths have woken up. And they preached about the resurrection. And a few months later, they woke up in August. They fell asleep in the Lord at the end of October. On exactly their feast day, is celebrated on the 22nd of October, according to the Julian calendar. Now, what's interesting is that St. John Vatatzes' his day of memory, according to the Julian, is on the 4th of November, which is less than 2 weeks away. In fact, it's exactly 13 days away from the 7 youths of Ephesus, their day of memory. Now, why this matters is because if you have a look at most days of celebration of St. John, and we know the Orthodox Greeks are in the new calendar, the Gregorian or the Neo-Julian calendar, you do notice that it appears that the celebration of St. John III's memory actually takes place on the 4th of November, on exactly the same day as the local people celebrate the 7 Youths of Ephesus. It just so happened that these two feast days are celebrated at the same time. And it's almost as if providentially we're given a hint that perhaps St. John Vatatzes, who is also asleep at the moment, similar to the 7 Youths of Ephesus, is still awaiting his awakening by God's grace in order to fulfill a certain duty and role in the future. And the reason why I think this is also relevant and why the reference to the 7 Youths is important is because Saint Seraphim of Sarov, in the famous Great Diveva Secret, which is one of the prophecies given to the Russian people, also speaks about his own temporary resurrection before the end of the world in order to preach to the Russian people and to assist Russia during a time when its clergy will fall away from the faith. This is not just a random prophecy from a random Russian saint. Saint Seraphim of Sarov is far from being not recognized as an authority on spiritual matters in Russia. And this particular prophecy of Saint Seraphim of Sarov was uncovered and made public by Saint Theophan, the Archbishop of Poltava. That's Saint Theophan Bystrov, a very famous ascetic of the 20th century, and in fact, the spiritual father of the Russian royal family and the Russian Tsar in particular for many years, until he became a bishop, in which he had to, of course, move his duties and perform administrative tasks of that nature. And again, the other great hierarch of the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, Archbishop Averky Taushev, who many in Rokor will know, he's one of the great teachers of Jordanville. In my reckoning, most likely he will be canonized in the future as well as a great bishop of Orthodox America, essentially. And Averky Taushev also published this great Diveva Secret prophecy. Now, this prophecy matters again because Saint Seraphim of Sarov makes reference to the 7 Youths of Ephesus, and he states that just like they were asleep, so will I be reposed and I will awaken for a temporary time at the end. And I'm paraphrasing the prophecy here. It's quite lengthy, but Saint Seraphim speaks about the 7 Youths. And so I don't think, Gregory and Conrad, it is at all inappropriate to make reference to the 7 Youths of Ephesus as a direct analogy to St. John Vatatzes waking up from a long, grace-filled slumber, gifted by the Lord in order to assist Orthodox Christians during a time of need. I think this is very well in the Orthodox tradition, and Saint Seraphim of Sarov's, great clairvoyant prophecy about the hardships in Russia with him coming back as well, I think speaks to that, is that this is not an isolated case. It's not a very unique miracle, despite the fact that it is very special and in fact very unusual and supernatural, just as all miracles are. But I don't think it's not hyperbolic at all to say that this is exactly what may take place during these great tribulations and times, essentially leading up to the Third World War. I also think it's worth mentioning that the 4th of November in Russia today, so the feast day of St. John Vatatzes, is a public holiday because the 4th of November, 1612, is when the Russians celebrate the liberation of Russia from the Judeo-Polish, well, I call it Judeo-Polish, but it's the Polish occupation of Moscow during the time of troubles, right? Which the next year in 1613 saw the election, not really election, but the appointment of Michael Romanov to the Tsardom of Russia. And this is very important because the 4th of November is also the feast day of the Kazan Theotokos. And in Russia, it did take place. The Youths of Ephesus are actually celebrated again in this particular time. So all of these things are deeply connected. And I think it's not accidental at all.
Thank you, Dimitri. It's fascinating, the dates, the way the dates interplay is fascinating. And I think there is something to it, even though I can't quite put my finger on it. But there must be some deeper significance. Now, as regards the prophecies, there seems to be a fairly consistent prophetic tradition, even though the origins of this tradition are not as clear. So the earliest prophetic text that we have in this strain is prophecy attributed to Saint Methodius of Patara. Now, the Saint Methodius lived in the early 4th century. According to non-Orthodox scholarship, this text was composed 3 centuries later in the 7th century, originally in Syriac and then translated into Greek and Latin. At least that's what scholarship says. But it's remarkable that it became very far widespread, and it was repeated by later similar texts. So it's worth taking a look at. The basic summary is this. The Saint Methodius, or the author, mentions that the Hagarenes, which are descendants of Hagar, a quick reminder, because this will be often recurring terminology. Hagar was the maidservant of Abraham in the Old Testament, the mother of Ishmael by Abraham, and they were thrown out at God's command. And according to the tradition, Ishmael was the progenitor of the Arab tribes. So the Hagarenes or Ishmaelites are the Arabs, and by extension, the Muslims. So St. Methodius, the author, says the Hagarenes attack and take over Constantinople, and then various other things happen. I'm skipping over some details, just getting to the main points. Then he says that the blonde race will have control over the seven-hilled city. Now, if this is really from the 4th century, when St. Methodius lived, this could be a reference to Germanic tribes taking over Rome, because Old Rome was also built on 7 hills, just like New Rome, Constantinople, was built on 7 hills. Now, in the Orthodox Church, Scripture and generally prophecy has many layers. There can be multiple interpretations, and both of them are true. It's not either or, it's both and. So if St. Methodius really wrote this in the 4th century, he could have had the Germanic tribes. That could have been what he meant, but unbeknownst to him, God would have included a deeper significance, a second fulfillment later on for the New Rome. In any case, back to the text. The blonde race will have control over the seven-hilled city for a while, 5 or 6 months. Quick side note, in later times, in the Ottoman era, the Greeks used the term blonde race as code for Russians. Then a little farther down, he says that there will be a general disturbance of many nations in the north and in the south. A great battle takes place in the seven-hilled city, and, quote, the killing of the people will flow like a river. The sea will turn turbid and darkened by the blood till the bottom of the abyss. It's important to note that St. Cosmas in the 18th century repeats that line, that there will be so much fighting in the city is Constantinople, that it will be a river and so much blood. And this is important, I think, because even if we don't know, even if the author is not St. Methodius, it's somebody anonymous, the fact that St. Cosmas would either knowingly repeat it or unknowingly make the same prophecy, in my view, corroborates the credibility of this prophecy. Before I go on, I wanted to make a quick note. Currently in the phase of history, we're at a part where it's very easy to envision Russia at some point attacking Turkey. It's been talked about if Turkey closes the Bosporus and doesn't allow any Russian ships through. In this 21st century timeline, if Russia, the blonde race, takes over the seven-hilled city, defeats the Hagarenes, and holds it for 5 or 6 months, then says that there's a general disturbance of many nations in the north, in the south, and they come together in Constantinople. Could the north be NATO or Europe, the west, which is against Russia? Could the south be the other Islamic nations who might be coming to the aid of Turkey? Just a thought. We'll find out eventually, I suppose. And in any case, all these nations converge, and there's this tremendous battle with rivers of blood. The sea turns red till the bottom of the abyss. And then I will just read it. It's not that long. It goes on to say, at that time, a voice from heaven will cry out, let us stop, let us stand aright, let us stand still. Peace be unto you. There has been enough vengeance against the disobedient and against those who would not listen. Now depart to the right-hand areas of the seven-hilled city, and there you will find a man who is standing on 2 columns, in very sober mood. He will be bright in appearance, just, charitable, dressed modestly, severe in appearance, but peace-loving in character. And a voice from the angel will be heard, make him your king. And they will give a sword to his right hand, and they will say to him, take courage, O John, and be strong and victorious over your enemies. And taking in his hands the sword indicated by the angel, he will beat the sons of Ishmael and the dark-skinned ones. The Greek says Ethiopians, which is what Ethiopians literally means burnt faces. And every infidel nation will beat them back. And the sons of Ishmael he will divide into 3 groups. 1/3 he will kill by the sword, 1/3 he will baptize, and the rest he will bring under submission in the east. It's important to note, same exact thing is repeated again by St. Cosmas, which shows that either God inspired him to prophesy the same thing, or he had read this, very likely, and was repeating it. And the fact that a saint 2.5 centuries ago repeated this prophecy, again, I think that's credibility, shows that it's blessed, it's from God. And conclude, and upon his return from his expeditions and battles, the treasures of the earth will be opened, and everyone will become rich, and nobody will be a poor man, and the earth will give its fruits 100-fold. And all weapons of war will be converted into plows and scythes, and he will rule for a period of 35 years.
Thank you so much for listening to the free preview of this huge episode of Aether Hour with Gregory. Behind the paywall, you'll hear all sorts of fantastic prophecies regarding the future of the Marble Emperor, St. John Vatatzes. I tell some amazing stories that I've heard from spiritual children of Elder Ephraim who have personally seen the Marble Emperor. So these are some fantastic things that I want everybody to be able to hear. So share this episode. And if you haven't already, get behind the paywall. And with that, we will see you on the other side. God bless.